This podcast contains material of a violent and disturbing nature. It is not suited for all audiences.
Hi and welcome to episode 11 of Horror Tales, a podcast in which you can sit back and listen to a scary story. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm the producer of Horror Tales. Today's story was written by David Surface and was originally published in the 10th Black Book of Horror from Montbury Press. It is narrated by Kieran Davison and the sound design and music are as always produced by myself. It is called The Last Testament of Jacob Tyler.
My name is Jacob Tyler. Let there be no mistake or controversy about my identity. Jacob Tyler is my true Christian name. No other false name or names that I've provided my current employers, for reasons which will soon be made clear in the story I'm about to relate. My personal effects: a pocket watch and my Tyran rifle. I bequeath to whatever man discovers my remains and gives them a Christian burial. These items, in particular my rifle, I would have preferred to leave to a son. But in this, as in much else, I have been disappointed, cursed, some would say. So to the man who takes this rifle from my hands, may it serve you better than it has served me. All my life, I have earned my living at the barrel of a rifle, until the age of 30. As a hunter of wild game, and later as a trapper for Mr. Astor's company. When the fur trade dwindled, and the price of game did also, I hired out my rifle for other enterprises, such as protecting properties in dispute, or returning escaped slaves to their owners. I know some men, good hunters, who refuse such work. But I have never seen the point of such scruples. Say what you will, as long as there are slaves, there will be those who escape, and those who hunt them down. It seems to me that such work is best done by professionals. I am, as I have said, a hunter and a trapper by trade, and those skills have served me well. Still, by the autumn of 1845, I was unable to find work, none that suited me. A man too long out of work will grasp at the first thing that looks like salvation, as will a man who has spent too much time alone. My wife's maiden name was Kathleen Van Cortlandt. Her sharp tongue, that I took at first for wit, and her quick temper, that I mistook for passion, soon made their true selves known to me. The property that came to me through marriage had been in my wife's family, as she was fond of saying, for the better part of 100 years. It was in its day a decent piece of land, yielding a good crop of wheat, as well as milk and apples. I had been married but a fortnight when a man approached me in the tavern, and began to make offers to purchase the 25 acres. When I told my wife of this, she became furious and made it known that no amount of money could bring her to part with her birthright. She then went on to revile me for my drunken and wasteful ways. Not wishing to hear more, I left her at her raging and went to the tavern where I drank many glasses of brandy to still the angry voices in my head. It was about this time that my wife fell victim to consumption and soon took to her bed. Doctors came and went, and she spent her days and nights in the most dreadful fits of coughing, until I thought she would choke. The only thing that gave her any relief was a tonic that a doctor had prescribed for her, of which she took 4 doses every day. This alone seemed to provide her with some repose. As my wife's illness increased, so did my hours at the tavern, where my debts likewise grew. The man who had wanted to buy the 25 acres continued to press me with his offers, which, in my circumstances, I was more and more loath to refuse. It was when I was preparing my wife's nightly dose of medicine that the idea came upon me. Taking the bottle to the kitchen, I poured 1/3 of the tonic into the basin and replaced it with spring water. If the taste was any different, my wife did not seem to notice, but I could hear her racking cough grow worse throughout the night. The next day, I poured out a little more of the medicine and replaced it with spring water. Indeed, my wife's fits grew worse and worse, till I could scarcely bear to hear them. And I fled the house for the tavern, where I spent several hours, waiting for that which I felt would not be long in coming. I waited until midnight had passed before I returned home. There was such a pall of silence within the house that I fully expected to find my wife's lifeless body in the bed where I had left her. When I entered the darkened bedroom, I could hear what truly were her last, labored gasps of breath. So far apart they came, that at first it seemed that she was no longer breathing at all. I fumbled to light the candle, that sputtered and sent wild shadows swelling across the walls. "Are you ready to die?" Those were the words that had formed themselves in my brain, and were now on my lips, ready to be spoken. When I turned and saw my wife sitting bolt upright in the bed, her lips curled back from her teeth, and her eyes wide open, with a look of malevolent fury that was not human. I cried out in terror and dropped the candle to the floor, where it instantly went out, plunging the room into blackness. I now felt 10 times the terror as before, and scrambled desperately to strike a light. But not before I heard my wife speak out in the darkness, in a terrible voice I could scarce recognize as her own. "Are you ready to die?"
Are you ready to die?
Hearing these words coming from my wife's lips, and in such a terrible, inhumane manner, I might have fainted away in terror, but I could not. So overwhelming was my desire to strike a light. If I was going to die, I wanted to see the agent of my death. Somehow, My trembling hands managed to light the candle. When I did, I was amazed to see my wife once again lying in bed on her back, her eyes still wide open, but with no light left in them. One touch at her throat confirmed it. She was dead. It was the work of less than a week to sell my wife's property for a greater sum of money than I'd ever seen. Once my debts were paid, it did not take long for me to incur more, and life, once again, became difficult. Moreover, rumors had begun to circulate that my wife's death may not have been entirely due to her illness. Indeed, word reached me that certain members of my wife's family were planning to bring the matter before the law. I had read in the newspapers of a property dispute in the Kansas territories where a man who was handy with a rifle could earn a decent pay. But my resources had dwindled to such an extent that a journey of that distance was beyond my means. Imagine then my great pleasure when I learned that the governor, Seward, was seeking armed men to help put down an uprising among tenant farmers in Delaware County. Delaware County, scarce 2 days' journey. It was, so I thought then, a gift from the Almighty. So, it was on a cold October morning that I cleaned my rifle, put my money into my boot, and set out with a group of 20 other men under the command of Sheriff Hendricks for the village of Anders. By midday, we were already deep into the Catskill Mountains, as dark and difficult a range as I have seen in this part of the country. We followed the meandering river, and before sunset we came upon the first homes of the residents of Anders. Pleasant-looking, white clapboard houses set back off the road. The men, women and children who witnessed our approach did not come forth to greet us, but watched from their porches and windows with caution and, it appeared to me, some degree of suspicion as we rode past. You can hardly blame them, said Jonas Peterson, a young man of Sullivan County who rode with us. The men who own this land can turn to these poor men and women to exact the money they need to pay their debts. But for these people, there is no one lower to turn to. That is why they have taken up rebellion. I asked Peterson if he was prepared to use violence against those for whom he felt so much sympathy. He looked at me with some alarm and said that the Governor Seward had brought us here to prevent violence, not to be the cause of it. When I saw that he actually believed this, I nearly laughed. But seeing the look on his young face, I decided to say nothing more, and we rode the rest of the way in silence. If young Peterson had weak and ill-formed notions about our purpose, there were none in Sheriff Hendricks' mind. The rebels we were about to face were desperate men, he warned, and would not scruple to use violence to achieve their goal. When I asked where this army of rebels might be found, he said without pause, "All around you." I cast my eye about the room, at the local men nursing their tankards of ale, and at the tavern keeper counting his coins. They do not appear to be as fearsome a foe as I had been told, I said. And what have you been told? He asked, fixing me with a cold glare. Merely that a few farmers have taken up arms against their landlords and wealthier neighbors. And what have you heard of the Indians? I confessed that during the ride from Dutchess County, I had heard some of the men speak of the Indians. Although I knew of no tribes in New York that still made war against white men. They are not true Indians, Henrik said with much disgust in his voice. They are cowards who put on savage dress and mask themselves with the hides and antlers of dead animals to hide their identity. They meet in secret and roam the roads at night to frighten the landlord and their own neighbors who are in sympathy with the forces of law and order. I would like to see these Indians, I boasted. The brandy had made my blood run hot. Besides, I wanted Henriks to see that I was not afraid of the childish tricks of a few poor farmers. You will see them, Henrik said, still unsmiling. Tonight. So it was on the evening of our arrival that Sheriff Henriks ordered us to assemble, with our horses and firearms, in the field behind Hunting Tavern. After muffling our horses' hooves with burlap and rope, we proceeded down the road that led into the woods north of town, taking care to go slowly so as not to raise any alarm. Our goal was an abandoned barn about a mile from town, where an informer had told Henriks the Indians would meet. Before setting off, Henriks cautioned us to be wary of ambush. Looking about me as we rode, I was reminded of why I had never liked hunting in the mountains, because of how the land rises up on every side and lets no light pass through the trees. In that darkness, there could be 100 of the enemy crawling near, and you would never see them until their hand was at your throat. After we had ridden for a half an hour, a light came into view. A small white flame hovering motionless in the darkness. Drawing closer, we could see it was a solitary candle burning in the window of the barn we sought. A black, dilapidated structure that squatted alone in a clearing. Henriks raised his hand and signaled 24 men to spread out in a wide circle to prevent those of us who were going in from becoming surrounded. The rest of us then dismounted and proceeded to make our way on foot through the trees toward the barn and that solitary candle. I thought it odd that these rebels had placed a candle in the window of what was supposed to be a secret meeting place. It did not bode well. Henriks himself approached the barn door, rifle in hand. After waiting for us to gather around, he gave the door a mighty kick. It swung open and Henriks leapt inside with a shout, and the rest of us rushed in behind him, quickly deploying along one wall so as not to shoot our fellows in battle. Within a moment, it became clear. We had been deceived. The barn was empty. There was only that one candle burning, and, for some reason, a lingering smell of tar. Henrix walked over to the candle that had been set on the rotting windowsill and touched it with curious fingers. It was at that moment that one of our party cried out in a voice that was terrible to hear, looking about for a source of his alarm. I thought at first that we must be under attack, but saw nothing moving in the shadows around us. I then looked at the man who had cried out, and saw his gaze fixed on a point high above our heads. There above us, in the rafters of the old barn, was a man, or what had been a man. His limbs had been bound and stretched so far apart that he looked like a bird stripped and splayed for gutting. And now we could all see where the smell of tar had come from. If you've seen drawings in the newspapers of men who have been tarred and feathered, those comic figures are fun, like creatures from children's books. Then you have not seen the bulging, blinded eyes, the skin burned black by the molten pitch, the places where the skin itself has been torn away by the victim's struggles. It was at that moment when we heard cries of alarm and gunshots from outside. We swiftly ran out, glad to quit that barn and its horrible tenant, and saw two men running toward us, their faces white with alarm. They related how they had been standing watch when a face suddenly appeared between the trees. A face one man described as like a scarecrow, and the other described as a withered corpse. Both men claimed to have discharged their firearms in the direction of that terrible face, which remained motionless, looking at them, then melted back into the darkness. As these two men were relating this story, there arose all around us a terrifying clamor, like the howling and braying from the throats of 1,000 unseen animals. I saw more than one of the younger men looking wildly about, naked fear in their eyes. Henrik shouted at us to stand fast. We followed his command until the terrible clamor died down and finally ceased altogether. Afterward came a silence that seemed even more threatening than the awful din that had preceded it. Before departing, Henrix ordered the barn to be burnt to the ground. So, we rode the first half mile back to town, with that conflagration at our backs, obliging us to watch our own shadows writhing ahead of us on the ground. Whether Hendrix ordered that poor man to be cut down, or left him hanging there to burn, I do not know to this day. After we had stabled our horses and returned to our quarters for the night, I asked Peterson if he was still in sympathy with the rebels, now that he had seen their handiwork. The young fellow seemed shaken, but still undaunted in his opinions, stating that the rebels were decent men, driven to indecent acts by terrible circumstances. It occurred to me that one might say the same of any man. and I thought to engage young Peterson on this point. But he had already taken to his cot and turned his face to the wall. The following morning, I noticed that our tavern keeper was not to be found in his usual place. I later learned that he was the informer who had led us to that barn, and the same unfortunate wretch we had found hanging in the rafters. Henrix was not daunted by the loss of a single informer. In a village where every soul knew someone or something worth telling, new informers were all around. After breakfast, Henrix ordered 10 men, including myself, to accompany him to the village stables. Upon arriving, we found no one but a young boy of 12 or 13, who looked upon us with great suspicion, and, it seemed to me, fear. "Where is your master?" Henrix inquired. The boy said nothing, but continued to stare at us with the wide eyes of a frightened animal. "Speak, boy!" Henrix raised his voice. "Where is your master?" Gone," the boy finally stammered. "Gone where?" Henrix demanded. To Bavina, to shoe a horse." "So," Henrix said, "the horses in Bavina have no one else to shoe them." To this, the boy made no reply. I was sure that Henrix was about to lay hands on the lad. Then he spoke more quietly. "Come, there is something I want to show you." Henrix led the boy, who came with some hesitation, out of the stables and into the sunlight, where he stood squinting at the other members of our militia, standing by with their rifles in their arms. "Do you see it?" Henrix asked. The boy looked around, even down at the dirt at his feet, a look of confusion on his young face. "You don't see," Henrix said. "Then you must look closer." At that, he grabbed the boy by the hair and plunged his head into the trough, holding it deep underwater. The boy thrashed and kicked, but Henrix's grip was iron. Finally, he pulled the boy free from the water, still holding him by the hair. "Do you see it yet?" Henrix asked. The boy was gasping and choking, and could not answer. "Then look again." He plunged the boy's head back underwater and held it there while the boy flailed and kicked. When he pulled the boy from the water again, the lad's face was blood red, and water poured from his nose and mouth. "Where's the meeting place?" Henrix shouted in the boy's ear. "Where do the devils meet tonight?" Without waiting for an answer, Henrix shoved the boy's head underwater again and held it there longer than before. The boy's thrashing grew weaker and weaker, and when Henrix pulled him up again, he seemed already half drowned. "You want to breathe?" Henrix said. "Tell me where they are meeting tonight. Then you can breathe." I saw the boy's lips moving, but could hear nothing. I saw Henrix put his ear close to the boy's mouth. and closed his eyes, nodding slowly. Then Hendricks rose up and spoke in a gentle-sounding voice. "Now you can breathe." He then patted the boy on the shoulder, put his pistol to the back of the boy's head, and shot. A black hole opened in the boy's forehead, with a great spray of brains and blood, a look of surprise on his young face. Then he slumped forward into the trough, sloshing water that Hendricks took care to step away from before it could wet his boots. I confess that I was startled by Hendricks' action. In my time, I had seen men do terrible things, with some goal or result in mind. But what Hendricks had just done seemed unnecessary, wasteful. Even more so when I asked if the boy had told him where the rebels would meet. "No," he admitted, then added, "Now we don't have to look for them. They will come looking for us." That night, Hendricks ordered us to assemble once more, behind the inn, at moonrise. This time, there was no muffling of our horses' hooves, no orders to move quietly. We rode for half an hour, north of town, to a quarry, where flint had once been taken from the ground, now a deep bowl in the forest floor. Hendricks ordered several men to descend into the quarry, where they struck tents and built a campfire that they lit and left blazing. Then Hendricks ordered us to climb high into the trees around the quarry's edge and be ready with our rifles. The moon had almost climbed to its highest place in the sky above when I heard them coming. At first, nothing more than a distant snap of a twig. Then I saw them moving through the trees below. Dark shadows, the moon illuminating a grotesque painted mask, a set of antlers, then more and more of them, until it seemed the whole forest floor was alive. They poured down the sides of the quarry, and I thought of a herd of deer I had once trapped in a dead-end gulch, and shot, one by one, as they struggled to leap the steep walls and climb over each other as they fell. The figures below moved closer to the empty tents and the campfire, their grotesque faces illuminated in its reddish glow. Then Hendricks gave the order, and the trees all around exploded with volley after volley of rifle fire. Figures below fell to the earth and were trampled by more figures running to escape the hail of bullets from above. I shot one man in a red and yellow robe with a painted scarecrow face, who was waving a scythe and shouting. Then another with a pair of bull's horns on his hooded head, who fell to the ground screaming and writhing like a snake until I shot him again. Altogether, I shot 15 men. When Hendricks shouted the order to cease fire, the forest was full of the haze and stink of gun smoke, and the quarry below was carpeted with bodies, some of them still moving. We climbed down from the trees and walked among the bodies, shooting the ones who were still alive. Before we left, Hendricks ordered 2 men to douse the bodies with coal oil and set them afire. From the cries that rose from the smoldering mass, I knew we had left some alive, despite our best efforts. So I stood and fired my rifle in the direction of those cries, until either the bullets or the fire had silenced them. When we had done with this work, Henrix led 30 men, including myself, north along the King's Road, where he believed some of the rebels had fled. He left behind a contingent of 20 men to make sure that the fire did its work. Peterson was among those left behind at the quarry. His face, when I last saw it, was ghost white in the firelight. I didn't know if he had fired any shots tonight, and, seeing the haunted look on his face, I determined never to ask him. We rode north along the King's Road, halfway to Delhi, encountering not a soul along the way. Finally, Henrix gave the order to turn and go back. As we rode, I became aware of the darkness ahead, growing thicker and heavier. The way the sky feels just before a storm. I cursed the mountains around us that blocked out the moon, the trees that crowded close and let no light through. When I saw a dark figure coming toward us, moving in a halting and unnatural way, like a scarecrow being pulled along on strings, I raised my rifle, and all the men around me did the same. Then we saw. It was Peterson, but a horrid, changed version of the man we knew. His head had been laid open, with a great wound from which the blood flowed, soaking his white shirt red. Black, scorched marks covered his hands and face, and the smell of burnt cloth and flesh hung heavy upon him. As we ran to meet him, he stumbled to his knees, and by the time we reached him, he was lying full on his back in the middle of the road, staring up at the moon and the trees, with a look on his face that was terrible to see. "Where are the others?" Henrix demanded. "Dead," Peterson answered in a choked whisper. "Dead?" Henrix said. "How? Not all dead?" "All dead," Peterson rasped out. They came out of the fire, still burning, with their masks and pitchforks, and their scythes, still burning. They are coming." "Who?" Henrix demanded, although by now he knew the answer, as surely as we all did. "The men," Peterson said. "The men we killed tonight. They are dead." Henrix spoke loudly and deliberately, like someone trying to wake a child from a bad dream. "They are dead," Peterson said. "And they are coming." With that, a sudden rushing sound rose up from the dark road ahead of us. Like a great wind moving through the trees, and with the smell of smoke, tar, and burnt things. When I looked back down, Peterson had ceased breathing. Suddenly, there came a hideous torrent of noise out of the darkness ahead of us, like the one we had heard before, like cries from the throats of 1,000 unseen animals. At that, several of our men broke ranks and took off running through the trees. Henrix shouted at the deserters who did not stop, and took a shot at one, although he missed. He then ordered us to retreat to a barn that stood just off the road, where we bolted the doors, positioned ourselves at the windows, and made ready to face what was coming. I checked my rifle, wiped the sights clean with my thumb, and fixed my gaze on the road, waiting for a target. As I stared into the darkness, I saw a flickering glow through the trees that grew brighter and closer. Torches, I thought. Then I saw the figures that approached by the hundreds were not carrying torches. It was they themselves who were burning. God help me. They were all burning. In a second they were on us, in a great howling rush of wind. Doors and walls burst inward in a shower of sparks, and the nightmare figures stepped through, laying about with their scythes and pitchforks, butchering men like pigs at a slaughter. All around me, men screamed and fired their guns uselessly. I saw Henrix firing his Colt again and again at one of the burning devils, who lifted him by the throat with one hand and forced a pitchfork through his chest, pinning him to the wall while the poor man kicked and squealed in a thin, shrill voice that was horrible to hear. A tall, robed figure appeared before me, burning antlers rising from its head. Its face, the skull of a great stag, painted red and black, with the skin dried and cracked like leather. It was on me in one stride, grasped the back of my neck in a grip like iron, and pushed me to the floor, pressing my face down into the dust. I could feel its great head lean closer, hot breath and heat from the smoldering skin licking at the back of my neck. Then it spoke into my ear, through the burning cloth and leather, in a voice that I knew. It was my wife's own voice.
Are you ready to die?
It was then that I screamed, as I had not screamed since I was a child. I screamed like a sick man, emptying himself of the poison that burns his insides. Something left me then. I don't know what, but something went out of me. And with it, the feel of that hand, of her hand on my neck. I did not feel it release me. One moment it was there, the next moment it was gone. At first, I believed I had been dreaming. Then I woke at dawn and saw the terrible slaughter all around me, the scorched and blackened bodies of men where they had fallen. Then I rose and walked away from that burning ruin, away from those black mountains, away from Delaware County. I went as far as my money would carry me, and put as many miles as I could between myself and that cursed place. I finally reached the Nebraska territories, where a land company hired me to watch over a large property and keep all unwanted persons from entering. And so, I come to the end of my story. And yet, it is not really over. Not yet. Every day I sit here, with my old Tyrant rifle across my knees, looking out over this strange, unbroken horizon, and wait for them to find me. Let them come. I am ready now. Still, when I dream of dark glades and vales and hills pressing close on every side, I am relieved to wake and find this flat and empty landscape that stretches out all around me. Because if there is something coming for me, as it surely must, I want to see it when it comes.
Thank you for listening to Horror Tales. My name is Max Ablitzer and I'm a music composer. If you have a project that needs original music or sound design, you can get in touch with me over at horrortalespodcast.com. That is horrortalespodcast.com. A special thank you to David Surface for contributing the story, The Last Testament of Jacob Tyler. You can learn more about his work at his website at davidsurfacewriter.wordpress.com. That is davidsurfacewriter.wordpress.com. Also, a special thank you to Kieran Davison for narrating the story. Kieran Davison has his own YouTube channel on which you can listen to more scary stories narrated by him. It is called Distant Light Narrations. That is Distant Light Narrations on YouTube. And another big thank you to Pierre Bujarski and Dave Nyland for the performance of the Voices of the Horde, and to Alison Latondres for the voice of the dead lover. I hope you enjoyed listening, and let's meet again on the next episode of Horror Tales.